Captain Marcus Brooks sits with a cup of coffee looking straight into the camera. Good evening, I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger there is. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 618. Gate 14 at JFK was chaos on a Thursday afternoon. A delayed connection from Boston had dumped 40 extra passengers into an already crowded holding area, and Flight 618 to Los Angeles was boarding in 15 minutes. Maria Alvarez sat near the window with her hands folded over a canvas tote bag, watching the rain streak sideways across the tarmac. She was 62 years old, small and steady, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a simple clip. Her cardigan was soft with age, mended once at the elbow with thread that didn't quite match. She'd bought the cheapest ticket available 3 weeks earlier, a middle seat, 34B, wedged between strangers for a 6-hour flight, because every spare dollar she had was going toward a wedding dress fitting and a deposit on a reception hall in Los Angeles. Her daughter Sophia was getting married in 5 weeks, and Maria intended to be there for every appointment leading up to it, even if it meant flying coach in a seat that barely reclined. Beside her at the gate, Victoria Sanford scrolled through her phone with the practiced impatience of someone who flew first class often enough to have opinions about everyone who didn't. Victoria ran a boutique interior design firm in Manhattan and had once memorably described flying coach as camping with strangers. She glanced at Maria's cardigan at the tote bag with its frayed strap and made a small private judgment she didn't bother hiding particularly well. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin boarding Flight 618 to Los Angeles. First class and priority members, please have your boarding passes ready. Victoria stood immediately smoothing her blazer and moved toward the jet bridge without a second glance. Maria waited for her group to be called, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, running through the wedding checklist in her mind, the way she had for weeks now. Dress, flowers, seating chart, the toast she still hadn't finished writing. When Maria's row was finally called, she made her way down the aisle to seat 34B near the back of the aircraft, and discovered with a small sinking feeling that Victoria Sanford, somehow rerouted from first class due to an aircraft swap, was seated directly beside her in 34C. "Oh," Victoria said, not quite masking her disappointment. "This is a joke." Maria said nothing, simply settled into her seat and buckled her belt. She'd learned over 62 years that some comments didn't require a response. "I paid for first class," Victoria continued, mostly to herself, adjusting her bag with irritated precision. "And now I'm back here, in coach, next to—" She paused, glancing at Maria's cardigan again. "Well, no offense." "None taken," Maria said quietly, and opened a small paperback she'd brought for the flight. A worn copy of poetry her late husband had given her 20 years earlier, its spine cracked from repeated reading. Sophia had offered more than once to buy her mother a better seat. A birthday gift, she'd insisted, or an early wedding guest. "Thank you." But Maria had refused every time, quietly redirecting the money toward the florist deposit instead. She'd spent 22 years learning to make do with far less than a cramped middle seat, and some habits built in places with no comfort to speak of simply didn't wear off once the uniform came off. The flight attendant, a young man named Curtis Boyd, moved through the aisle checking seatbelts and offered Maria a warm smile as he passed. "Ma'am, can I get you anything before we push back?" "Just water, thank you," Maria said. "And is there any chance of an aisle seat further back?" "I don't need much, just easier access if anyone needs to get by." Curtis checked his manifest. "Actually, we're pretty full today, ma'am. I'll see what I can do once we're airborne." Victoria, overhearing, muttered just loud enough to be heard, "Some people really shouldn't fly if they can't afford better seats." She said it lightly, almost as a joke to herself, but Curtis's expression flickered with discomfort as he moved on down the aisle. Maria didn't respond. She turned back to her book, and Flight 618 pushed back from the gate into the gray New York afternoon, carrying 184 passengers toward a flight that none of them yet knew would test every assumption at least one of them was carrying. 90 minutes into the flight, somewhere over Ohio, the seatbelt sign chimed off, and the cabin settled into the low murmur of a long-haul routine. Laptops open, headphones on a toddler, 2 rows up, finally asleep after 40 minutes of restlessness. Maria had drifted into a light doze, with her book resting open on her lap, the first real rest she'd had in days of wedding planning. She woke to a commotion near the front of economy. A man in seat 12, a mid-50s business suit, a laptop bag still gripped in one hand, had slumped sideways against the passenger beside him, his face gray, his breathing shallow and irregular. The passenger beside him, startled, called out for help, and within seconds, Curtis was moving up the aisle at a near run, his professional calm cracking just slightly at the edges. The man had been rushing to a conference in Los Angeles, the kind of trip he'd made a dozen times without incident. He'd sprinted through a gate change at JFK, skipped his midday heart medication in the scramble, and told himself he'd take it once he was settled. He never got the chance. Somewhere over eastern Ohio, his heart slipped into a rhythm it couldn't sustain, and by the time the passenger beside him noticed his breathing had changed, precious minutes had already passed, unnoticed beneath the ordinary hum of a cabin at cruising altitude. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" Curtis knelt in the aisle, checking for a pulse, his training kicking in even as his hands trembled slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor or medical professional on board, please make yourself known to a flight attendant immediately." A ripple of anxious movement passed through the cabin. A young man, 3 rows back, raised his hand hesitantly. A third-year medical student, he explained, though he'd never handled anything like this outside a classroom. He moved forward to help, but his hands hovered uncertainly over the unconscious man, clearly out of his depth for what was unfolding. The man's condition worsened. His breathing grew more labored, his lips taking on a faint blue tinge. The medical student kneeling beside him looked up at Curtis with open panic. I think this might be cardiac. I don't have enough training for this. We need someone with real emergency experience." Curtis straightened and moved toward the intercom near the galley, his voice steadier than he felt. "Cockpit, this is Curtis in the cabin. We have a medical emergency, possible cardiac event. Row 12. We have a med student assisting, but he says he needs more experienced help. No doctor has come forward." In the cockpit, Captain Elena Ruiz and First Officer Daniel Osei exchanged a fast, wordless look. The specific tension of 2 professionals recalculating a flight plan in real time, mentally pulling up the nearest suitable airport for an emergency diversion. "Get me a status update every 2 minutes, Ruiz said, "and check the manifest for anyone with a medical background. Sometimes people don't come forward unless we call them out directly." Osei pulled up the passenger list, scanning names and any special service requests attached to bookings. Most carried no information at all. But near the bottom of the economy cabin list, one line caught his attention. A small, easily overlooked flag from a prior flight profile. Alvarez Maria, retired U.S. Army Nurse Corps Flight Medic Certification. Osei's eyebrows lifted. "Captain, we've got someone. Seat 34B, former Army flight nurse." Ruiz didn't hesitate. "Get Curtis back there now." Curtis moved fast down the aisle, scanning row numbers until he reached 34B, where Maria was sitting bolt upright, now having heard the commotion but unsure whether to involve herself uninvited among strangers who hadn't asked for her help. "Ma'am, are you Maria Alvarez, former Army flight nurse?" Maria's expression shifted, old instincts rising fast beneath the surface of a woman who hadn't worn a uniform in 11 years but had never quite stopped being who she was underneath it. "Yes, what's happening?" "Medical emergency row 12, possible cardiac. We have a med student assisting, but he needs help. The cockpit specifically asked for you by name." Victoria beside her blinked in open shock. "Wait, you're a nurse?" Maria was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "Flight medic, 22 years Army Nurse Corps. Excuse me." She moved up the aisle with the calm, economical urgency of someone who had done this before, in far worse conditions than a pressurized cabin at 35,000 feet, helicopter medevacs under fire, forward operating bases with no equipment beyond what she carried on her back, a career built on exactly this kind of controlled crisis. She knelt beside the unconscious man, checked his pulse at the carotid, lifted an eyelid, assessed his breathing pattern in under 10 seconds. "What's his history?" she asked the medical student, her voice low and steady. "His wife said he has a heart condition, arrhythmia, I think. He took his medication late today because of the flight delay. Pulse is thready, irregular. Possible atrial fibrillation with reduced cardiac output." Maria turned to Curtis. "I need the AED and the medical kit now, and ask the cockpit if there's supplemental oxygen available beyond the standard kit." Curtis relayed the request immediately. Within 90 seconds, Maria had the automated defibrillator pads positioned, the medical kit open beside her, oxygen flowing through a mask fitted carefully over the man's face. She worked with a focus that silenced the surrounding rows passengers who'd been craning for a look, now simply watching, quiet, as a woman in a faded cardigan did precise, practiced, life-saving work 3 rows from where they sat. "His name's Robert," the med student offered, checking the boarding manifest on Curtis's tablet. "Robert Hensley." "Robert," Maria said clearly close to his ear. "My name's Maria. I'm a nurse. You're going to be okay. I need you to stay with me." The man's eyes fluttered, not fully conscious, but responsive, a flicker of awareness passing through the gray pallor of his face. Maria monitored his breathing, adjusted the oxygen flow, checked his pulse again at 30-second intervals, narrating each observation to Curtis, who relayed it directly to the cockpit. Talk to me about his medication, Maria said to the man's wife, who had moved into the aisle, her hands pressed together, watching every motion with wide, frightened eyes. What does he take, and when did he last take it? Metoprolol, the wife said, her voice shaking. Twice a day. He missed the noon dose. We were running for the gate. He said he'd take it once we landed. Maria nodded, filing the information away with the calm efficiency of someone who'd triaged worse in far less controlled conditions. That tracks with what I'm seeing. Irregular rhythm, likely a missed dose flare. His pressure's dropping, but it's not free-falling. We caught this early enough. She glanced up at Curtis. Tell the cockpit his vitals are trending in the right direction, but I still want paramedics meeting us on the ground. No exceptions. The medical student, still crouched beside her, exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. I've done clinical rotations. I've never had to do any of this without an attending standing over my shoulder. You called it right, Maria told him, not looking up from Robert's pulse. You recognized cardiac before anyone else did, and you didn't freeze. That's most of the job. The rest is just repetition. It was a small thing to say, but the young man's shoulders visibly loosened, some of the panic draining out of his posture as he kept working beside her. In the flight deck, Ruiz listened to the updates with visible relief, loosening the tension in her shoulders. She's stabilizing him, she told Osei. Divert to Denver. Anyway, I want paramedics meeting this aircraft the second we're on the ground, but she's buying us time. Back in row 34, Victoria Sanford sat alone, watching the scene unfold 3 rows ahead, with an expression that had shifted over the last 10 minutes, from confusion to something closer to shame. She'd spent the first 90 minutes of this flight forming a private, unkind story about the woman beside her, the worn cardigan, the frayed tote bag, the modest paperback, and every assumption in that story had just been dismantled in real time by a stranger who'd knelt in an aisle and taken control of a medical emergency without a second's hesitation. A woman across the aisle who'd overheard Victoria's earlier comments leaned over. That's the lady you said shouldn't be flying, isn't it? Victoria didn't answer. She sat with her hands folded, watching Maria work. Steady hands, low, calm voice, complete command of a crisis. Most people in that cabin, herself included, wouldn't have known how to face. Further back, other passengers had begun quietly piecing together fragments of the scene. The word Army passed row to row, then medic. Then a hush that fell over that section of the cabin as more people realized what they were witnessing. A teenager 2 rows behind Maria's empty seat had started recording on his phone before his mother gently reached over and lowered his hand, telling him some moments weren't meant for an audience. An older veteran near the emergency exit sat up a little straighter in his seat, watching with an expression of quiet recognition, the particular look of someone who understood exactly what kind of training produced hands that steady under pressure. 15 minutes later, with Robert Hensley's vitals stabilizing enough for the immediate danger to pass, Maria finally rose from her knees in the aisle, her cardigan sleeve stained faintly with antiseptic from the medical kit. Curtis thanked her with visible emotion in his voice, and the medical student, still slightly shaken, shook her hand with something close to reverence. "Where did you learn to move like that?" he asked. "You didn't even hesitate." "Afghanistan," Maria said simply. "Kandahar mostly. You learn not to hesitate because the person on the ground doesn't have time for you to think it over." She glanced down at Robert, whose color had returned enough that his wife, seated beside him, had begun to cry with relief rather than fear. 22 years of it. You stop counting the close ones after a while. As Maria made her way back to row 34, passengers she passed offered quiet words of thanks, a few reaching out to touch her arm briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing through the cabin. When she reached her seat, Victoria was standing in the aisle, having stepped out to let her back in, her earlier irritation entirely gone. "I don't know what to say," Victoria said quietly. "I made assumptions about you before you'd said a single word to me. That was wrong. I'm sorry." Maria settled back into 34B, checking her pulse against her own wrist out of old habit, a reflex from decades of monitoring herself as closely as her patients. "You're not the first person to judge a cardigan before they judged the woman wearing it," she said without bitterness. "Won't be the last either." "It's all right." "It's not, though," Victoria said. "You just saved a man's life, and 20 minutes ago, I was complaining about sitting next to you." Maria allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Then maybe that's the part worth remembering. Not what you said, what you do with it now." The aircraft continued its diversion toward Denver, paramedics already confirmed and waiting at the gate. Robert Hensley, stable and resting under a blanket, with his wife holding his hand. The medical student checking his vitals every few minutes at Maria's quiet instruction. 40 minutes from landing, the intercom crackled to life, and Captain Ruiz's voice filled the cabin. Steady, warm, carrying just slightly more emotion than standard cockpit announcements usually allowed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ruiz. I want to take a moment before we begin our descent into Denver. About an hour ago, we had a passenger experience a serious medical emergency on board. Thanks to the quick thinking of our crew, and thanks to one passenger in particular, Maria Alvarez, in seat 34B, a retired Army flight nurse, that passenger is stable and will be met by paramedics the moment we land. A ripple of applause broke out across the cabin, passengers turning in their seats to look toward row 34, where Maria sat with her hands folded, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. "Mrs. Alvarez," Ruiz continued, "on behalf of this crew and every person on this aircraft, thank you for your service both today and for the 22 years before it. This flight and this passenger are better off because you were on board." The applause grew louder. Curtis, standing near the galley, was openly wiping his eyes. Victoria, beside Maria, joined the applause with both hands looking at the woman beside her, with something that had shifted entirely from where it had started 3 hours earlier. Maria, quietly overwhelmed, simply nodded toward the intercom speaker and returned to her book, though she didn't read a single word of it for the rest of the descent. At the gate in Denver, paramedics moved quickly aboard to transfer Robert Hensley to a waiting ambulance, his wife thanking Maria through tears before following the stretcher down the jet bridge. Captain Ruiz stepped out of the cockpit personally, still in uniform, and made her way back through the cabin to shake Maria's hand. "I flagged your name off the manifest," Ruiz admitted. "Didn't expect it to matter for anything more than routine curiosity. Glad it did." "You did the hard part," Maria said, "diverting keeping this crew calm, giving me the room to work. I just did what I was trained to do." "That's usually how the people who matter most describe it," Ruiz said. "Small, like it was nothing. It wasn't nothing." Osei stepped out of the cockpit behind her, extending his hand to Maria as well. "For what it's worth, ma'am, the FADEC and every other system on this aircraft ran perfectly the whole flight. You were the only variable. Nobody planned for, and you're the reason today isn't a very different story. Thank you." Curtis, still visibly moved, walked Maria's tote bag up from where it had been stowed and handed it to her personally, rather than letting her retrieve it from the overhead bin herself. A small, unnecessary courtesy that meant more to her than he probably realized. "I've worked 11 years for this airline," he told her quietly. "I've never seen anything like what you did back there. I won't forget it." Victoria lingered at the edge of the aisle as the cabin slowly emptied, then approached Maria one last time before disembarking. "I own an interior design firm in Manhattan. I know that has nothing to do with any of this, but if there's ever anything I can do for your daughter's wedding, for anything, please let me." Maria considered the offer, and for the first time all flight, allowed herself to accept a kindness without suspicion. "My daughter's getting married in Los Angeles in 5 weeks. We could use a little help with the flowers if you're serious." "I'm completely serious," Victoria said, pulling out a business card. "Consider it done. And Maria, thank you, not just for today, for letting me learn something I needed to learn." Maria took the card, tucked it into her worn tote bag beside her late husband's book of poetry, and made her way off the aircraft, still in the same faded cardigan she'd boarded in, carrying the same frayed bag. Except now, every person she passed in that cabin understood exactly what quiet, unassuming strength had been sitting in seat 34B the entire time. I've flown with crews who panicked over turbulence, and I've watched a woman in a $30 cardigan save a man's life without raising her voice once. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not the price of the ticket, that truly separates us. If this story moved you, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next flight.